Welcome back, boss. In this, part 3 of our examination of setting in MGSV, we turn now to Afghanistan. The country we call Afghanistan today has long been at an important geopolitical crossway. This has made it a sought-after possession by empires and their rulers going all the way back to the times of Alexander the Great, and a religion called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was a key precursor to monotheism, which Friedrich Nietzsche believed originated the doctrine known as predestination. Zoroaster is believed to have possibly been born in Afghanistan. The religion's signature practice is the worship of fire. The religion is still actually practiced in parts of the Middle East to this very day. According to Ahmed Rashid in Taliban, Militant Islam, Oil and Fundamentalism in Central Asia, throughout its entire history, Afghanistan has itself been all but predestined to be caught up in larger powers' affairs. If we take a sweeping glance through Afghanistan's history, we find exactly the same dynamic playing out that defines the background of the character from MGSV, Skullface.
I was born in a small village. I was still a child when we were raided by soldiers. Foreign soldiers. Torn from my elders, I was made to speak their language. With each new post, my masters changed, along with the words they made me speak. Words are peculiar. With each change, I changed too.
Though, as I mentioned, Afghanistan has changed hands over the centuries, from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan, it has remained a largely patchwork tribal society defined by internal rivalries and geographic isolation. It was with the rise of great power rivalries in the 19th century and its age of imperialism that Afghanistan increasingly began to find its fate totally determined by outside influences. The British tried 3 times to conquer Afghanistan, and failed each time. It was only by turning its patchwork of tribes against one another that the British managed to convert Afghanistan into a client state. The shape of Afghanistan's borders, as we see them to this very day, were drawn onto the map by British hands. In MGSV, we come into Afghanistan through Peshawar, specifically traveling by the Khyber Pass. As an example of how haunted this game is by phantoms of the past, and how important that setting is to MGSV, the Khyber Pass as well as the Durand Line both go back to British occupation in the 19th century. And it was this same passageway that Alexander the Great had used to enter India. When author Peter Bergen visited the pass on his way to interview Osama bin Laden for CNN in 1997, he saw traces there that still remained on the walls of insignia from British regiments who had fought for colonial India a century prior. It's been said that words can kill, and for proof one only needs to look at how this mapping of Afghanistan killed the legitimacy of a Pashtun nationhood. The British checked the potential future existence of 2 threats with one line, their so-called Durand Line. This would have huge consequences for years to come. Our first destination is Spugme Keep, which opens like a torii or Japanese shrine gate, marking the border between our world and the spiritual realm in their religion of Shinto. Fittingly, as the ghost of Big Boss, we seem to emerge out of these fragments and fossils from the past. Careful examination of Spugme Keep reveals it is a partial skeleton of a structure that once must have been far larger. It seems to have been built in a strategic location as well, one that made great use of the surrounding mountains as natural defenses. Fugme Keep, to my eye, resembles this, the Kala-i-Bost arch in the south of the country. It once opened on a fortress called Bost, dating back all the way to the 11th century. It's very famous, as it appears on the 100 Afghani note. In general, there are principally 3 different kinds of locations in MGSV's version of Afghanistan: ruins, Soviet facilities, and Soviet-occupied former villages. According to Kojima, in a podcast, he designed Afghanistan to resemble the nation Jordan, which is particularly evident when we look at the vast expanse of leaky desert. I'd wagered this was done in part to give the setting a classic, almost Disney-like Middle Eastern appearance, as a way of channeling imagery from the Bible, Torah, and Quran. Afghanistan is one of the most densely populated lands with ancient ruins in the world, many of which go all the way back to some of the earliest points of known history. The country still bears the marks, the fossils of the different rulers and empires that have possessed it across centuries of time. From one ruler and culture to another, Afghanistan has changed hands many times. Thrown across it are shards and fossils of its history in the form of a plethora of different ethnic groups. In antiquity, Afghanistan once served as a buffer zone to keep apart the Persian and Turkic empires. In the 19th century, history repeated itself, this time with Afghanistan serving as the buffer between the British and Russian empires. The worship of fire is hardly unique to Zoroastrians. Many of us know about the story of Moses and the burning bush, when the Israelites were, in the monotheistic myth, under oppression by the Egyptian pharaoh, longing to be set free. We also may know of the destruction of the sinner cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. However, there's a more important monotheistic story for MGSV, one that you could argue has connections in some respects, as do these other stories I've mentioned, to the logic or cultural aspects behind the creation of the atomic bomb. That story is the one of evil King Ahab, the foreign infidel queen Jezebel, and God's righteous and vengeful prophet Elijah. To make a long story short, Ahab was a king of Israel who fell for a pagan named Jezebel and allowed for her religion and culture to spread into the kingdom, which was strictly forbidden. Elijah was sent by God to prove the righteousness of the monotheistic faith by a demonstration of summoning fire. In awe of Elijah's magic powers with fire, the Israelites promptly did God's will in the story and slaughtered all the non-believers. There's a lot more to the story, but in general it conveys the idea that might makes right. Produce a terrifying, almost supernatural expression of force, and you have proven that you speak with words, backed by the power and authority of God. The same logic would inform, arguably, not only Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also the 9/11 attacks. Lamarhate Palace could be mistaken for 2 different ruins, Darul Aman Palace and Taj Beg Palace. Both can have relevance to MGSV. Darul Aman Palace, which in Pashto means abode of peace, is uncharacteristically neoclassical in its architectural style. That's because it was built for the king of Afghanistan in the 1920s by French and German architects. Repeatedly burned and damaged over the next century or so of conflict, for years it's represented the lost dream of a modern and peaceful Afghan state. Taj Beg Palace, meanwhile, was also built in the same era and context. Eerily, the same pattern of hardline conservatives rejecting reform would play out again with the war against the Soviet Union, and yet again still with the formation in the early 90s of the Taliban. It was inside the Taj Beg Palace that in December of 1979, the Soviets murdered their own puppet president and his family in Operation Storm 333. Lastly, for this video, there's Desmase Fort, which to me resembles ruins of the former site of the Bamayan Buddhas. This pre-Islamic site, once a symbol of Afghanistan's multicultural history, was destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. When Ocelot tells Snake that Miller's in Afghanistan, Snake reacts incredulously in his characteristic way of repeating a phrase back in disbelief. That's because for most of the mid-20th century, Afghanistan was a relatively peaceful place far removed from the world's attention. So how did it become synonymous with never-ending war, oppression, and Islamic fundamentalism? Let's find out.
Christmas Eve, 1979. The Soviet Union rolled into Afghanistan. Muslims had revolted against the Soviet-friendly regime established the year before. The DRA forces could no longer contain it themselves, so the Soviets went in to intervene. Everyone thought it'd be over in an instant. Only it wasn't. Afghanistan is a tribal society. Tradition demands that its people stand up to any outsiders who set foot on their land. With the honor of their people at stake, they have everything to fight for. Some Muslims made their fight a jihad, a holy war, and began a guerrilla campaign on all fronts. A war of attrition. These fighters call themselves mujahideen. They're being supported by the West through Pakistan. No matter how hard the Soviets hit them, they continue to appear out of nowhere, striking back, then vanishing again. Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic country. You've got the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras. Each ethnicity has several rebel organizations that their various tribes gather under. They're united under the banner of jihad, but that doesn't mean they work like a single standing army. The Hamids are based out of the city of Peshawar. We passed through it on the western edge of Pakistan. The Pashtun people have long lived in Afghanistan and western Pakistan. They used to travel back and forth frequently. Then Britain went and established the border that still stands today. The Hamid fighters get generous support from the Pakistani government. The government wants to use them to secure influence over Afghanistan. Their liaison with the Hamids is Inter-Services Intelligence, and behind the ISI, you have the CIA. The Soviet troops on the ground want to go home, but at least they have homes to go back to. The Afghans have lost theirs. The war has become a nightmare for the Soviet troops stationed here. They thought they'd be headed home in 6 months at the most. Then a year passed. 2 years. Now here we are 4 years on with no exit in sight. Afghanistan has become the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
The story of modern Afghanistan is the perfect background for many of MGSV's themes. The country epitomizes double crosses, blood feuds, dystopia, and misinterpretations that lead to disaster. In 1973, after 200 years of monarchy, the king of Afghanistan was overthrown by his own cousin. Afghanistan then became a republic in a non-violent coup. In this new secular republic, 2 political parties emerged within the leftist branch. You had the more moderate Parshamites and the more radical Khalq faction. When a respected Parshamite was assassinated, it catalyzed with the so-called Sour Revolution in 1978, and apologies if any of these pronunciations are wrong, an overthrow of the president, who along with his entire family was murdered in his own palace. Replacing him would be the so-called Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, led by 3 men, Nur Taraki, Hafizullah Amin, and Babrak Karmal. Taraki began to model his new society around the Stalin-era Soviet Union, with himself as its great leader. The Soviets supported his regime, but did not directly get involved in running it. After all, the Soviet Union was, by the late 70s, entering its age of terminal decline. One sick and aging leader after another would soon come and go in Russia in rapid succession. This made the events to come all the more disjointed and ironic. Rivalry between Taraki and Amin distracted the Afghan communists from the rise of popular dissent against them in the rural countrysides. Taraki's brutal repression set the stage for a burgeoning resistance movement that, when deprived of Taraki as the subject of its vengeance, would have no one to then vent against but the Soviet Union. Taraki was deposed and assassinated by Amin in the fall of 1979. By December, Amin and his entire family would be massacred in turn by the Soviets, who were fed up with watching Afghanistan's communist revolution collapse. This took place in December of 1979. The decision to do so was never formally called an invasion. The Soviets at this point were like a twitching headless chicken. The decision to intervene was made in part based on untrue suspicions that Amin was in league with the CIA. And these decisions were made over the course of several different leadership regimes. When this invasion was met with wide-scale Afghan resistance, the Soviets, who badly misunderstood the country's tribal patchwork of societies, made the poor choice to crack down on them hard. Conditions were then made ripe for a Soviet version of Vietnam, a protracted asymmetrical conflict. The US pounced on the opportunity, covertly sending weapons and money to the Afghan forces. At the same time, President Carter took the Nuclear Treaty SALT II off the table at a point where it was already struggling to be ratified by the Senate, despite it having already been signed by the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the US finds itself in need of friendship with Pakistan, as its notorious scientist A.Q. Khan begins working on obtaining a nuclear bomb. This is to check India, Pakistan's ethnic and religious rival, who successfully tested their own in 1974. With America's tacit approval, Khan will go on to build a massive procurement network for obtaining nuclear technology from the likes of China and North Korea, establishing the foundation for what will become nuclear proliferation after the Cold War. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Secret Service, the ISI, began to pursue making Islamic fundamentalism a major force in the world, with the war in Afghanistan to serve as their central focus. Part of this is a desire to unify Pashtuns into a single polity, as well as check Soviet encroachment. The Afghans who oppose the Soviets begin to call themselves Mujahideen, derived from jihad, meaning holy warriors. To covertly train the Mujahideen, the CIA turns not only to the ISI, but the legendary British SAS. The SAS will not only induct the Afghans into the principles of Special Forces warfare, but train them later on in how to use the US-provided homing weapon, the Stinger. Meanwhile, the world stage is set for the later Gulf War in 1990-91 with the Carter Doctrine, which declares the Persian Gulf off-limits as part of America's sphere of influence.
Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America.
This was in response to the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. An NGO alleged to have been a CIA front is established in 1981, called the Committee for a Free Afghanistan, or CFA. Under the guise of charity and medicine, the CFA provides a channel for weapons and money. In 1982, the CIA is made legally exempt from self-reporting on its own involvement in drug smuggling. Heroin, consequently, will become a major source of revenue for the Afghan Holy War and a major cause of addiction and suffering for not only the Afghans, but the Soviets stationed in their country. Afghanistan will rapidly become the heroin capital of the world, replacing Vietnam. Also involved with charity fronts is the wealthy member of a famous Saudi construction dynasty, the man named Osama bin Laden. Like Kazuhira Miller, bin Laden is a privatization advocate, using fronts like MAK, also known as Al-Qifa, or the Struggle. Bin Laden creates a network for private donors to support the Mujahideen through. Bin Laden draws on his background in business to make war a new kind of business. This establishes the foundations for what will become the age of privately funded terror. And an international business without borders is what results. Bin Laden would soon join in the fighting himself, though, under the banner of so-called Afghan Arabs. These were non-Afghans who had come to the country to fight the Holy War in the name of radical Islam. Soon this would grow into something about much more than just defeating the Soviets. It would become about, in the classic sense of a dystopia, using modern technology and business practices to reinvigorate a medieval era by constructing a so-called Islamic State a new Ottoman Empire, not unlike how the Nazis had sought to revive a version of the Holy Roman Empire as their so-called Third Reich. Central to this new movement was martyrdom, sacrificing yourself by turning your own life into a weapon against evil. This was the era, in other words, when weapons learned to walk upright. Bin Laden's mentor was a Palestinian sheikh named Abdullah Azzam. Together they created the MAK, or Al-Qaeda, which I mentioned before, a Diamond Dogs-esque group that would go on to become the international terrorist movement called Al-Qaeda. The MAK is allowed to establish nodes along its burgeoning global network in over 30 cities across the United States throughout the 1980s. Azzam comes to the US to deliver fiery sermons recruiting American Muslims into his organization. One of the nodes established is the Al-Qaeda Refugee Center in the Al-Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, New York. This mosque will be used to plot both attacks on the World Trade Center. Bin Laden builds the Coast Tunnel Complex in Afghanistan, as his MAK organization seemingly establishes many ties to the CIA. Controversially, according to former British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, even the name Al-Qaeda, commonly translated as the base, actually first meant the database, and referred to, he claims, a CIA database that cataloged all the thousands of mujahideen who had been recruited in the war. Whatever the explanation, bin Laden would form Al-Qaeda near the end of the war in 1988. Meanwhile, the CIA continued to support comrades of his, like the so-called blind sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who is unapologetically anti-American. He would play a pivotal role in the World Trade Center bombing and the Twin Tower attacks of 2001. Though it would be easy to conclude that, since the CIA funneled money and provided support to the Mujahideen, and since Osama bin Laden was a member, that the CIA created what would become Al-Qaeda. This isn't strictly true. Remember that bin Laden was wealthy and operated as one of the so-called Afghan Arabs, who were only a small part of the Mujahideen effort. Most of the decisions, meanwhile, where the CIA's money was actually routed, was made not by the CIA at all, but by its middleman, the ISI. And bin Laden, after all, didn't really need outside financial support. The situation is more, as far as I can tell, about the CIA's recklessness and short-sightedness, as well as its general policy of trying to divide and conquer. Much like Saudi Arabia, the CIA may have made the mistake of assuming that by empowering extremists, like the Mujahideen, that it would convince those extremists to see the US differently. The reason this did not, nor likely could ever work, involves two countries that are outside Afghanistan, namely Egypt and Israel, to which we'll have to turn briefly now. This is yet another long and bitter story, but roughly speaking, time and time again, over the last 2 centuries, we see the phantom of the British Empire living on in the form of the US, the UN, and the English language, by way of a general policy of divide and conquer. Yet again, as we saw in Cyprus, in Palestine after World War II, nationalism defined things in terms of only one people and one culture. The so-called mandate system that had been created by the League of Nations made that country the ward of the British Empire, leading up to the Second World War. In 1947, one of the earliest plans created by the League's next of kin, the United Nations, was the so-called Partition Plan for Palestine. In the days of British imperialism, regions belonging to the Royal Crown had been penciled in on the map in red. And now, as the Palestinian Plan demonstrates, even though it was never actually implemented due to the civil war that it caused, that red on the map would become green. So-called green lines, like the kind found in Cyprus and later, after America's invasion in Iraq, would soon be appearing in crisis zones the world over. And these crises would largely, arguably, be the result of various ethnic or cultural antagonists taking UN principles like national self-determination at face value. As you may well already know, as a direct consequence of the UN's decision to honor the 1948 Israeli Declaration of Independence, a so-called Arab-Israeli conflict would grow into a state of perpetual warfare, one that's still waging to this very day. Now, the creation of Israel was a way of the UN trying to deal with the problem of global anti-Semitism, and dealing with that while also respecting the idea that the UN had no place in policing or regulating the affairs of a country within its own borders. Since the nationalist paradigm implied one culture and one people, and since nationalism was key to the United Nations, Jews as minorities were seen as problems. Israel gave these persecuted Jews around the world a nation to escape from anti-Semitism to, vitally important considering that this occurred in the wake of the Holocaust. In Israel, they could be the majority group and they could be safe. But as a consequence, this turned Palestine into less than a nation, thereby, according to the new nationalist rules, stripping them of rights. Abdullah Azzam, bin Laden's mentor, was Palestinian. The situation between Israel and Palestine in the 20th century rapidly became something called Pan-Arabism, where many Arab nations felt solidarity with the Palestinians and began to resent and demonize Israel and its allies. By the end of the 20th century, Pan-Arabism would become Islamic Jihad. Though, tragically, Pan-Arabism had been secular, and of course jihad is defined by religious fundamentalism. Gradually, this conflict between Israel and Palestine brought Egypt into the equation. Arab National Socialist Gamal Nasser, Egypt's defiant ruler at the time of the Suez Canal crisis, in 1950 decided to block Israel's access to the Straits of Tiran. A chain of events resulted in the so-called Six-Day War of 1967, as well as with Israel's occupation of part of Egyptian territory. In 1973, an Arab coalition struck back with the Yom Kippur War, and this time around the result was almost an all-out nuclear exchange between East and West. There's a lot that we could cover here, so let's try to keep it simple. To prevent any further near misses with Armageddon, the US and Israel in 1974, at the end of the Yom Kippur War, signed the Sinai Agreements. These agreements basically tied the US and Israel at the hip, providing Israel what the Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs in 1997 would call the largest voluntary transfer of wealth and technology in history. Then there were the Camp David Accords, brokered by the US between Egypt and Israel. Many Arab extremists felt betrayed by the Accords, so they assassinated, in retaliation, Egypt's ruler. His replacement, Hosni Mubarak, cracked down not only on extremists but all Muslims generally, and transformed Egypt into a police state pulled right out of Orwell's 1984. Speaking of Orwell, the Afghan Arab movement is not unlike the international socialist movement that brought writers like George Orwell into Spain to fight against fascism prior to the full outbreak of World War II. Bin Laden's other mentor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was Egyptian. So you see, these various nationalities realized that they were powerless in their own countries, powerless apart. The only solution was to form an international Islamic revival, build an entire identity out of a form of militant Islamic extremism, and try and unite all Muslims into a new nation, an Islamic state, and thereby bring back from the dead the Crusades. Of course, all this is only the world as these Islamic extremist terrorists see it. I don't mean to defend these perspectives in any way, rather to explain them as a historical development influenced by the alliance between Israel and the US, which in turn, thanks to the Yom Kippur War, was forged only by necessity thanks to the Cold War and the threat of nuclear weapons. The Israelis were nearly forced during that war in 1973 to use their secret nuclear arsenal, which would in turn have triggered a chain reaction, likely, that would have ended the world. 9/11 is what resulted from the burgeoning world of worldwide militant Islamic terrorism finally getting its hands on a deterrent of its own in Pakistan in the late 90s. Rather than confronting the ties that bind jihadists like bin Laden to countries like Pakistan or the US's important economic ally Saudi Arabia, America embarked after 9/11 instead on a project to remake the mind of the Middle East, to make it safe for Israel-friendly, democratic, or at least American-friendly nation-building. Instead, whether by secret intent or sheer historic blunder, the US has perpetuated the very problem it went into the Middle East to solve, the problem of religious extremist terrorism. The war in Afghanistan would spawn the war in Iraq, which would in turn eventually spawn the second coming of al-Qaeda and bin Laden in the form of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State. Yet though these various groups speak strictly in religious terminology, what I've tried to demonstrate in this video is beneath them lies not inherent racial, cultural, or religious divisions, but the contingent course of modern, secular geopolitics. Nothing can justify terrorist attacks on civilians. Tragically, the 9/11 attacks played on the dichotomy between their huge and terrific catastrophe and a silent secret enemy. Following the attacks, this specter of the enemy may as well have become America's shadow, given we began seeing it everywhere. The ironic cycle for the story of Afghanistan then became complete. First, in the late 70s, the events of Operation Storm 333 had deprived the militants in Afghanistan of their true target of revenge, causing them to turn, as America's partial puppets, against the Soviet Union. Then, in the early 21st century, 9/11 deprived Americans the true targets of their revenge, causing them to turn as al-Qaeda's partial puppets against Afghanistan and eventually Iraq. The chain of retaliation that had begun in the 1980s has come to truly bind the world as one. The Soviet-Afghan War began the age of international Islamic terrorism as a major force. Huge masses of fighters and money were at the ready for the former Afghan mujahideen. The networks and fortunes that had been built to strengthen Islamic extremist terrorism against the Soviet Union now were freed up to focus on the next generation of enemies. After the former satellite states in the Balkans would come the United States. The rows of burned bodies during Skullface's speech feel like nods to that first stage, the 90s Balkan Wars. A country that used to be named Yugoslavia blew to pieces after the fall of the wall. Society itself disintegrated in the most brutal and hate-fueled conflict since World War II. Among the Muslims targeted by the ultra-nationalists in countries like Bosnia and Serbia were members of the Mujahideen, that holy war that reached its goal yet did not, for some, ever end. The pain of the ensuing war crimes and brutality for many in the region have, even now, 30 years later, not stopped hurting. Nothing could better accompany the phantom pains, themes of race and cultural conflict than the awful tragedies that this war inflicted. I've been told the uniforms worn by the Soviets in Afghanistan and MGSV resemble those worn by Russians fighting in the Balkans. So what became of Afghanistan? Well, following the Afghan-Soviet War, they had lost their monarchy, their status, but bin Laden was long gone, having returned home to Saudi Arabia a conquering hero. But soon a falling out over the Saudi-US alliance and the 1990-91 Gulf War would lead bin Laden to become cast out of his own family and country. That's when he entered the true terrorist safe haven prior to Afghanistan, the Sudan. As we'll see if there is a next time, given the issues with demonetization, Africa was really where global militant Islamic terrorism grew after the Soviet-Afghan War. But by May of 1996, bin Laden, for the second time since the war's end, would be returning to his ultimate outer haven, the tribal areas and mountains across the Durand Line that divided Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is here, roughly the same region as the Afghan setting of the Phantom Pain, that by the fall of 2001, bin Laden would join forces to some degree with a stridently militant and medieval faction within the Afghan civil war called the Taliban. While the Taliban provided him with a safe haven, bin Laden reorganized al-Qaeda in 1998 after declaring war on America August 23, 1996. It was in Afghanistan, his old battlefield, that he built terrorist training camps, which began to take in numbers of recruits from all over the world. It was then that the stage was set for the catastrophe that would later be known as 9/11. What remains truly strange about al-Qaeda and 9/11, as well as surprisingly relevant to MGSV by way of Orwell's 1984, is the alleged involvement behind the attacks of a group known as the Islamic Brotherhood. In 1984, the book, The Brotherhood is the secret underground movement Winston Smith gets tricked into trying to join, and whose real existence is left by the novel's end tantalizingly, torturously, an open question. The Islamic Brotherhood, likewise, may or may not exist in the way that some reports and exposés have shown. The only brotherhood we know for sure exists is the public side, the charitable and humanitarian organization. But according to reports in mainstream American outlets like Newsweek, another side exists too, a clandestine, paramilitary, conspiratorial side. Though credibly established, so far the connections surrounding the Brotherhood and 9/11 hijackers like Mohammed Atta, at least publicly, have never been investigated. Instead of tracking down the ultimate origins and financing behind 9/11, the US government, led by its so-called neocons, focused more on exploiting the attacks for maximum political gain. The result has been 2 or 3 costly wars that have never ended, and the exponential growth of private forces, terrorists on one hand, private military contractors on the other. US official Richard Dick Cheney was pushing for wholesale privatization of the military as early as the 1990 to 91 Gulf War. After 9/11, Cheney got his wish. And with it, a kind of religious faith in neocon, as well as evangelical American Christian beliefs, permeated this period. The Bush administration were as sure of themselves and their anointment by God as crusaders in a holy war, in a curious pantomime on some level of the terrorists themselves. This medieval attitude affected the whole atmosphere in America, so that anyone who disagreed or spoke out was branded an unpatriotic traitor at best, and criminally persecuted and targeted by the government at worst. Before long, questions of cause and effect, of reason, logic, and truth became irrelevant beneath the golden haze of truth as Bush's ministries manufactured it. Soon, in a truly Orwellian twist in America, the answer on the street to the question who did 9/11 would become Osama bin Laden's enemy, Saddam Hussein. Afghanistan became just a marketing scheme for America's new war on terror, an overture to the real prologue in Babylon, aka Iraq. Hastily abandoned and declared at its end, the war in Afghanistan, once the Taliban were given time to regroup and re-establish their presence in the global heroin trade, reignited. It has never stopped burning to varying brightness since. The Taliban governor of Kandahar's second limb is a wooden peg leg in the style of Long John Silver. Despite the availability of new artificial limbs now being fitted to the country's millions of amputees by international aid agencies, the mullah says he prefers his peg leg. Taliban, page 17.
The Manhattan incident triggered a serious public backlash. Now the U.S. has to think twice before intervening militarily in other countries' affairs. This has fueled a push towards military privatization, with PMCs at the heart of that movement.
PMCs? Private military companies?
That's right. PMCs have no basis in nations or ideologies. They are private enterprises, driven by profit. In addition to dispatching mercenaries to war zones, they secure weapons and train local soldiers. They're contractors for war itself, and business is good. Their clientele includes developed nations like the U.S., rebel factions looking to seize power by force, smaller countries lacking armies of their own, even terrorist groups. They're in the Americas, Asia, the South Pacific, Europe, Africa, the Middle East. The rise of the PMC has spawned a war by proxy, and it's spreading across the globe.
On September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers carried out coordinated suicide strikes by flying jumbo passenger jets into landmarks in Manhattan and Washington, D.C. These attacks were conducted by several sleeper cells of Al-Qaeda operatives who lived and trained in preparation for them while living inside the United States. But while the orchestrators of 9/11, as it was soon to be known, were individual men like Mohammed Atta, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and Osama bin Laden, it's crucial to note that there's something about the word Al-Qaeda that can't be directly translated. Ever since 9/11, the US has used this phrase, Al-Qaeda, mostly to refer to Osama bin Laden's individual terrorist organization. But according to Angel Rabase in Beyond Al-Qaeda, it can have several meanings. Not only can Al-Qaeda mean the base or the foundation, as we mentioned earlier, quote, but also a precept, rule, principle, maxim, formula, model, or pattern, end quote. In other words, Al-Qaeda is ultimately an idea, a word. Anyone who follows its model can become part of it. That, in other words, is an enemy that can only be fought using psychological warfare, which George Orwell's 1984 foresaw as the logical endpoint for how war would change in the coming nuclear and then post-nuclear ages.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
President Bush made this declaration of war against terrorism on September 20th, but the strategy that he would take, and by so doing force following leaders to take as well, was a strategy of fighting over hearts and minds. In The Phantom Pain, Skullface, we're told by Ocelot in one of the tapes, intends to use Sahelanthropus as a marketing tool to popularize Metal Gears as a new lingua franca around the world. If we switch Metal Gears in this scenario to terrorism, that's essentially what 9/11 accomplished. The attack was fundamentally an act of psychological warfare. We could even compare it to the Boston Tea Party or the famous shot heard round the world that started the Battle of Concord in April of 1775. The way those revolutionary events paved the way for a new idea to spread named nationalism, 9/11 was like the ringing of a different kind of Liberty Bell, a bell that proved the US could be attacked not by a country, not even by an army, but just by individuals. The actual perpetrators were already, of course, burned to ash and bone before the US even knew their names, deprived of its true target for revenge, and driven by the similarities between 9/11 and prior acts of war like the sinking of the Maine and Pearl Harbor.
Words to control the subconscious.
Remember the Alamo.
The US, both militarily but also, and this is crucial, unconsciously, only had one place to turn to, one target to vent their rage and vengeance upon: Afghanistan.
Iraqi forces join in. Jordanian units join.
If you're just tuning in for the first time to watch another program, it's hard to begin where to tell you how much has happened today. But the U.S., with the assistance of Britain, in at least one instance, has begun a major attack against the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda network in Afghanistan. And the President and the Secretary of Defense have been very careful to say this is an attack against the Taliban and against Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, not against the people of Afghanistan or against Islam. They've made that point repeatedly.
But other than serving as the location for some of bin Laden's training camps, Afghanistan itself factors into the future terror plot very little. The way Osama bin Laden and the jihadist movement wants to restore the order of a dead past is very similar to how Liquid and Solidus will later in the MGS series try and restore Big Boss's dying wish of an outer heaven, a nation of soldiers and nomads. Specifically, there's a legend that the Prophet Muhammad's dying words were, "Let there be no two religions in the Holy Land," what is modern-day Saudi Arabia. When the US-led Desert Storm War went on from 1990 to 91, it brought American troops, including women, onto military bases in Saudi Arabia for the first time. Bin Laden, who the Saudis had passed up and gone with the US-led coalition when time had come to punish Arab National Socialist Saddam Hussein for the annexation of Kuwait, would tell countless reporters that this intrusion on sacred lands was really the last straw. Soon enough, he would be declaring open war against the United States. I should also mention here the crucial importance relative to MGSV of grief. Bin Laden, mastermind of 9/11, ironically lost both his father and one of his brothers to plane crashes. Some have speculated that Bin Laden's militancy was a way of keeping some ghost of his beloved father alive. The same might be true of many different types of extremists, who are almost always motivated by some grievance or loss. Revenge is the easiest way to avoid dealing with life and its fundamental unfairness. Hideo Kojima, too, lost his father at an early age and seems to have been struggling with phantom pain over it his entire life. That's what makes Big Boss's demise, as well as the last lines in MGSV's theme, Sins of the Father, so resonant and so haunting. And another crucial theme for MGSV that we have here has to do with the word pedagogy. Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda considered themselves experts, even philosophers and religious authorities. In fact, Abdullah Azzam and another man named Mohammed Qutb, who introduced Osama bin Laden to jihad in the late 70s, were literally teachers. And the Taliban, as a word, means students in the religious sense. Pedagogy means instruction, roughly. It means lecturing and shaping a mind with rhetoric. This is part of MGSV's wider theme that words can kill, that words and ideas almost have a parasitic life of their own. The Taliban's leader in the 90s was a man that we can't help but compare to Big Boss, Mullah Muhammad Omar, one-eyed and very elusive and respect. Omar in 1996 increased his stature 100-fold by donning a literal holy relic, the cloak of the Prophet, to declare himself God's chosen big boss of Afghanistan. The last anyone would see of Omar, he was making a great escape away from American forces in 2002 on a motorcycle, driven by his right-hand man. Bin Laden, during the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, would be the seeds he implanted in the coming system. Called tribal areas along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan have become, in the decades since the 1980s, a hotbed for terrorist recruitment and training, especially in the region's madrasas or religious schools, where young Arabs are indoctrinated in this extremist minority sect of militant Islam. After 9/11, Afghanistan was the first target in the global war on terror. Ironically, only months prior to the US invasion, the Taliban had banned opium production for the first time in a bid to garner public approval on the world stage. This international pariah state under the Talibs, then suddenly bereft of what had heretofore been its primary method of funding, seemed to quickly collapse under the weight of American might. Although technically, the war in Afghanistan that began in 2001 was more of a proxy war, with the US backing the Taliban's longtime enemy in the country's civil war, the predominantly Tajik Northern Alliance. But within just a few years, the heroin trade resumed, and soon, becoming an insurgent became more profitable than practically any other profession possible in rural Afghanistan. This was only matched by the lucrative growth of the private forces industry in the United States.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The Bush administration's job was to find a way to channel and turn this rage onto different targets. But there was a major conflict within the Bush administration. On one side, you had Secretary of State Colin Powell and his Powell Doctrine. The Powell Doctrine was about pinpoint strikes with maximum force using full military mobilization. This worked to great effect during 1990-91's Operation Desert Storm. But on the other side, you had Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and his informal ally at the time, George Tenet of the CIA. These two believed the war in Afghanistan was no place for the Powell Doctrine, as they believed that it resembled the strategy that had been used by the Soviets with zero success. Instead of a conventional war, the Pentagon and the CIA insisted on a totally opposite approach, known today as that of the light footprint. Special forces, paid-off proxy fighters with CIA money, and high-tech unmanned armaments all working together in conjunction with mercenary outfits, like the infamous private military company Blackwater, Rumsfeld and Tenet believed would all be enough to provide a big win in Afghanistan. But as far as Rumsfeld was concerned, Afghanistan wasn't enough. He, alongside the other so-called neoconservatives that were in power at the time of 9/11, neoconservatives like Vice President Dick Cheney, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, and think tank analysts like Richard Pearl and Bill Kristol, all believed the US should do more than merely react to 9/11. Even before 9/11, these neocons had something in mind for how the US should shape what they referred to as the coming new American century. If the Middle East was a neighborhood full of arsonists, the neocons did not see the value in waiting around to put out the next fire. Instead, the global war on terror was envisioned as a war over the world's hearts and minds. The only suitable language here is the international language of advertising. 9/11 tanked America's brand image. It opened the door to the idea taking up occupancy in people's heads that the US was anti-Islam, that it didn't care about Arab people, that the only way to get its attention was through violent acts, targeting its citizens. That could have led to a major problem for the United States, given its central and singular importance to global economics, revolves around to this very day, a commodity that's primarily found in Arab regions: petroleum. Afghanistan in of itself mattered very little to this wider schema. Soon, even Osama bin Laden became a low priority. What really started to matter was rehabilitating America's image in Arab and Islamic parts of the world. In this sense, Afghanistan was just an overture to a prologue. First to consider was Pakistan, the neighbor to Afghanistan. Relations with Pakistan had to be maintained at all costs, given it was one of the most predominant Islamic countries on earth. This made the prospect of full-scale war against the Taliban and even Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, to some extent, imprudent. Afghanistan was invaded merely to support the new American proxy, the anti-Taliban coalition of all non-Pashtun ethnicities, already fighting a civil war with the Taliban there, known as the Northern Alliance. In some respects, America's approach to the war in Afghanistan would mirror the so-called no-win proxy wars fought by the CIA against Soviet proxies during the 70s and 80s in places like Iran and Angola. Only enough money, manpower, and attention, in other words, would be paid to ensure that neither side, the Taliban nor the Potkaman democracy surrounding Afghanistan's new Pashtun president, Hamid Karzai, would win outright. If the anti-Taliban side won, you see, it would have forced the international community, as well as Afghans themselves, to answer the difficult questions over who, if not Pashtuns like the Taliban, would really rule in Afghanistan, which is again a multi-ethnic country plagued with inner tensions and rivalries. This had the potential to trigger its own civil war. And further, if the Taliban were defeated, it could put the US on a war footing with their, as well as Al-Qaeda's, shadow backer. And Pakistan was already in a very precarious, dangerous position with its nukes that it had gained during the 1980s and 90s pointed right at its own religious and ethnic rival, India, who had nukes of their own. Who knew what opening a power vacuum in Afghanistan by defeating the Taliban might do to this precarious regional balance? The world was only narrowly avoiding regional nuclear exchanges as it was, not unlike how Huey's leg is just barely being kept upright by the pinpoint of this metallic archaea needle during this scene. That left only one battlefield for the US to focus all its attention on, Iraq. But that is the subject for another video. Once the war in Iraq started, all of the resources and attention shifted to it, leaving Afghanistan a quagmire that we're still dealing with to this very day. The Bush administration did not want to risk too many American deaths fighting this war, and this is where the light footprint concept came in. They did not wish to repeat the mistakes of the Soviet Union, as I said. Yet due to that sensitive situation with neighboring Pakistan, the US also failed to deal with either the Taliban or Al-Qaeda properly. As I mentioned, Pakistan's version of the CIA, the ISI, held numerous ties to both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Following a military coup d'etat in 1999, the country was totally dominated by the ISI, a country within a country we might even compare to outer heaven. War in Afghanistan was, as a result, little more than a virtual war designed to market the global war on terror as a kind of phantom echo, if you will, or shadow of 9/11. And it continues to rage to this day, fueled as it is by the black opium trade as well as the boom in private militaries. No war in American history has seen more of a close integration between state and private forces than the global war on terror. This, the longest war in US history in Afghanistan, continues to drag on as the US and eventually NATO forces got dragged into the same protracted asymmetrical skirmishing over the mountains and countrysides that the Soviets had fought decades before. With a shocking number of civilian deaths mounting, masses of refugees huddling, and an extremely counterproductive effect on global terrorism at large, Afghanistan has become, as I said, a quagmire, one that dwarfs even Vietnam. It is an enduring stain on the US, a stain that has ushered in an era where war has changed and become routine, all ironically in the name of revenge, the same kind of revenge 9/11 itself was perpetrated to inflict. The neo-Vietnam scenario that the CIA, along with Pakistan, China, and Saudi Arabia, had fueled against the Soviet Union, now consumes those who made it as the longest-running war in American history. In December of 2001, mere months after the 9/11 attacks, the US came close but failed ultimately to capture bin Laden, who slipped right out of their grasp during the Battle of Tora Bora. Bin Laden, like Mullah Omar, disappeared, only to be assassinated in a 2011 raid of considerable controversy. Though unceremoniously shot and dumped into the Arabian Sea, the thirst for revenge that bin Laden arguably planted, and the paradigm he pioneered of privately funded terrorism and private forces, lives on as his phantom. But though bin Laden would return by the late 90s to Afghanistan as he became a more globally known symbol for Islamic extremist terror, in the mid-90s, he would expand operations, much as we will next episode, into continental Africa.